It was an unusually quiet afternoon, the kind where the house felt strangely still, and the only sound was the rhythm of my own breathing. My son had gone out with his friends, leaving me alone at home. I decided to take advantage of the rare silence and unwind in my room. The soft sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a gentle warmth on the bed as I settled down with a book. But my mind couldn't focus. It wasn't long before I set the book aside, letting my thoughts drift. The silence was overwhelming, and a strange sense of unease washed over me. I found myself thinking about things I hadn't let myself think about in a long time, thoughts that were both thrilling and forbidden. I tried to push them away, but they lingered, teasing me until I couldn't ignore them any longer. I got up and walked to the mirror, staring at my reflection. My heart raced with a mix of excitement and nervousness. I was dressed casually, but there was something about how the fabric fit my body that made me feel seductive. I ran my hands down my sides, imagining what it would be like if someone else's hands were there. Someone who would appreciate every curve and contour. The thought quickened my pulse, and before I knew it, I was lost in the fantasy. I closed my eyes and let my imagination take over. The image of a strong, confident man filled my mind. Someone who knew exactly how to touch me, someone who could make me feel wanted. I could almost feel his hands on my skin, his breath against me, and the way he would whisper things that would make me shiver with desire. The fantasy was so vivid I hardly noticed the faint creak of the door opening. When I finally opened my eyes, reality came crashing back. Standing in the doorway was my son's best friend, his eyes wide with shock, and something else, something that made my heart race. He was supposed to be out with my son, but here he was, witnessing a moment I never intended for anyone to see. For several long seconds, neither of us moved, and the air between us was thick with tension. Tension that held more than just embarrassment. His gaze travelled over me, lingering in a way that made my breath catch. I could see the internal conflict in his eyes. Part of him wanted to turn and walk away, but another part couldn't seem to look away. I was the first to speak, my voice coming out in a soft, breathless whisper. I didn't expect anyone to come in. He swallowed hard, still standing at the door, gripping the doorknob as though it was the only thing keeping him from doing something. Something he might regret. I didn't mean to. I thought the house was empty. There was an awkwardness in the air, but beneath it was something else. Something neither of us could ignore. My pulse raced, and my mind scrambled to figure out what to do, what to say, but all I could focus on was the way he was looking at me. His eyes were darkened with desire, even as he tried to hide it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "It's okay," I said softly, though the words felt hollow. We both knew nothing about this was okay. The situation was hanging on the edge of something dangerous, something that could change everything. But instead of stepping back, I found myself taking a step forward, closing the space between us. I didn't know what I was doing or why, but it felt as though an invisible force was pulling me toward him, toward the intensity in his gaze that matched the heat building inside me. I could see his chest rise and fall, his breath quickening as he fought to stay in control. "I should go," he said, but his feet remained rooted to the floor. His voice was low, almost hoarse, as if the words were hard to say. I nodded even though I didn't want him to leave. "Maybe you should," I whispered, but neither of us moved. The tension between us was unbearable now, a magnetic force that was drawing us closer and closer, as if we were about to collide. I could feel the heat coming from his body, the way his eyes burned with a need that mirrored my own. Then, as if something snapped between us both, he took a step forward. Suddenly, we were inches apart. His hand reached out, hesitating just a moment before it touched my arm. A touch so light it was barely there, but it sent a shock through me. I gasped. "I'm sorry," he whispered. But his hand didn't pull away. Instead, it slid up my arm, leaving a trail of heat. I shouldn't be here, but I didn't want him to stop. I couldn't speak the words, but everything inside me was screaming for him to keep going, to close the gap between us. I looked up at him, my breath shallow and uneven, and in that moment nothing else mattered. It was just the two of us, standing on the edge of something we couldn't undo. Without thinking, I leaned into him, my body brushing against his. That was all it took. His hand moved to my waist, pulling me closer, while his other hand cupped my face, his thumb gently brushing my cheek, sending a shiver down my spine. I could feel his breath on my lips, the heat of his body against mine, and the world seemed to fade away. He kissed me, tentatively at first, as if unsure about what he was doing. But when I kissed him back, giving in to the pent-up desire I had been holding, something changed. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more demanding. The reasons why this was wrong faded, replaced by an overwhelming need that left me breathless. I didn't know how long we stood there, our bodies pressed together, lost in that kiss. But when we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing heavily, our hearts pounding. We looked at each other, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry." But there was no regret in his eyes, only a lingering desire that reflected my own. I shook my head, unable to speak, afraid that if I did, I'd say something that would complicate things further. He stepped back, his hand sliding away from my waist as if it pained him to let go. "I should go," he said again, but this time he moved toward the door. I watched him leave, a part of me wanting to call him back, to tell him to stay. But I knew I couldn't. What had just happened was something that couldn't be repeated, no matter how much I wanted it to. The door closed softly behind him, and I was left alone in the room, my heart still racing, my mind spinning with what had just occurred. I knew this was dangerous, that it could lead to something that would change everything, but I couldn't stop thinking about the way his lips had felt on mine, the way his hands had touched me. I sank onto the bed, replaying the moment in my mind, knowing this wasn't the end. What had happened in that room was a secret we would both carry, a moment that would linger every time we saw each other. It was a line that had been crossed, and there was no going back. The attraction, the desire, was too strong to ignore. I knew it was only a matter of time before it pulled us together again. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, trying to act normal when everything felt different. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he had looked at me, the way he had touched me. I knew it was wrong, but the excitement was intoxicating. Every time I saw him, it simmered just below the surface, impossible to ignore. We tried to avoid each other, to keep our distance, but it was no use. The pull between us was too strong. When we were finally alone again, it felt like no time had passed at all. The moment our eyes met, I knew it was going to happen again, that we couldn't stop it. He reached for me, and I went to him, all thoughts of right and wrong forgotten. In the heat of the moment, we came together with a hunger that was almost primal. Our bodies moved as though they were made for each other. There was no hesitation, no holding back. We gave in completely to the passion that had been building between us, letting it consume us. It was wild, intense, and felt so right, even though I knew it was wrong. The way he touched me, the way he made me feel. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. We were lost in each other, in the heat and desire, and nothing else mattered. When it was over, and we were lying tangled together, the reality of what we had done began to settle in. This was more than just a mistake. It was something that could have serious consequences, something that could change both our lives forever. He looked at me, his eyes a mix of satisfaction and uncertainty. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on me, mixing with the remnants of passion still burning inside me. "I don't know," I admitted. "We've crossed a line that we can't uncross." He nodded, looking troubled. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, though his tone carried more uncertainty than regret. "It just happened," I finished for him. "Sometimes things get out of hand, and then you're left dealing with the consequences." He reached out and gently took my hand, his touch both reassuring and intimate. "I don't want this to ruin anything," he said earnestly. I value our relationship and I don't want this to come between us. I squeezed his hand, feeling a rush of emotions. Neither do I. But we need to be careful. We need to figure out what this means for both of us. The quiet in the room was heavy with the weight of our actions and the uncertainty of what came next. We both understood the potential consequences but also recognized the deep connection that had brought us here. The days that followed were filled with emotions and tough decisions. We tried to maintain normalcy, but the tension between us was undeniable. Every interaction felt charged with what had happened, and it was hard to ignore the shift in our relationship. We found ourselves navigating a new dynamic, one that was both thrilling and daunting. There were moments when we'd exchange glances, the memory of what we'd shared stirring a blend of longing and discomfort. We both understood what had transpired, and it added a new layer of complexity to our interactions. As time passed, we began talking about what to do next. We knew we needed to be honest with each other. We had to address the changes in our relationship and ensure that the trust we'd built wasn't destroyed by one moment of passion. We both agreed that we had to face the situation openly, to talk about our feelings and fears, and work through the complexities of what had happened. We made a pact to communicate openly, to ensure we were both on the same page, and to rebuild the trust that had been tested. The emotional journey was challenging, but also rewarding. We learned new things about each other, deepening our connection. Though it was complicated, the experience ultimately brought us closer as we faced the aftermath together with honesty and respect. In the end, the intensity of what had happened served as a reminder of the power of desire and the importance of navigating relationships with care and awareness. It taught us about the complexity of emotions and the need for clear communication. The bond we shared remained, though altered by the events that had unfolded. We both learned valuable lessons, and while the experience was undeniably intense, it strengthened our connection. We moved forward, carrying the lessons we had learned and a deeper understanding of each other. The memory of that afternoon would always stay with us, a reminder of the passion and complexity that had marked a turning point in our lives.